Cuba Información.
In the early 1960s, when I was in the CIA, we all knew of the sabotage and the terrorism program that was going on against Cuba.
In the early 60s, the United States trained, armed, and directed groups of Cubans living in the United States to do subversive activities in Cuba against the Cuban people.
There are very few cases in history that are political by their nature. This was one.
Cuando tú ves imágenes cuando cayeron las Torres Gemelas de Nueva York, cuando tú ves acciones terroristas en España, en otros países, tú te llenas de indignación.
Fernando lo toman preso el 12 de septiembre del año 98. Para mí fue muy difícil asumir esa situación de que Fernando estaba preso.
Porque realmente ellos son 5 hombres que están monitoreando las actividades terroristas que se generan en Miami contra Cuba.
El plan contra Tropicana se planificó y se organizó en Miami. Estamos hablando de 450 gramos de explosivo plástico C4.
In the early 1960s, when I was in the CIA, we all knew of the sabotage and the terrorism program that was going on against Cuba. Of course, we didn't call it terrorism at that time. We in the CIA called them operations for the liberation of Cuba. In considering Cuba or analyzing this country in the early 21st century, there is, in my opinion, one thing to keep in mind always, and that is that Cuba is not a normal country. It is a country that has been under siege in an undeclared war by the United States for going on 50 years.
The problem is that a lot of people are very ignorant about the reality of Cuba back in Britain and in Europe. And whenever one takes up a position in support of Cuba back home, you always come in for criticism.
I have a quote that I'd like to read, a very short one, from Richard Helms. This man, Richard Helms, was the man who was running this program against Cuba in Washington. This is from testimony he made before a Senate investigating committee in 1975. He said, "We had task forces that were striking at Cuba constantly. We were attempting to blow up power plants. We were attempting to do all kinds of things in this period. This was a matter of American government policy." This comes from the man who was in charge. And he was meeting with the President of the United States and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense at that level to plan these operations against Cuba.
In the early 60s, the United States trained, armed, and directed groups of Cubans living in the United States to do subversive activities in Cuba against the Cuban people. The remnants of those groups are still very much alive and active in the United States and in Miami specifically.
Los entrenamientos son legales en territorio norteamericano, ya que los Comandos F4 es una organización no lucrativa inscrita en Tallahassee para promover la democracia en Cuba.
Those Cubans that control Miami today, right-wing Cubans, have been closely allied from the early 60s with the United States governments.
Are the Cubans supposed to just stand by and let these things happen? Or should they go to the source, which is Miami, where they can get the first-hand information on the planning at the earliest possible moment in order to set up their defenses? And this is precisely what they've been doing.
registrarse para la guerra, pero no criamos nuestros hijos para que vayan en una guerra que se nunca. Aunque, además de las simpatías por uno u otro partido, dijimos al principio que los latinos buscan
Radio Habana, Cuba.
Bueno, en primer lugar, por supuesto, hemos tenido que organizarnos en Cuba para poder defendernos de esos ataques. Y lo hemos hecho con bastante éxito, porque no ha sido una defensa solamente de los organismos especializados, sino con una participación muy activa del pueblo. Pero además de eso, lo hemos hecho en varias ocasiones ante las propias autoridades norteamericanas. Les hemos trasladado informaciones cuando las hemos tenido, los hemos alertado, sabemos que están planeando hacer esto, sabemos que piensan hacer tal cosa, etcétera, etcétera.